Okay, so get ready because today we're diving into a really heavy but really important topic. We're going to be looking at the case of Kiena Dawes,
Right.
a young woman from England who tragically took her own life back in 2023. Now, what makes this case so unique is the suicide note that she left behind.
Yeah.
Because in it, she accused her ex-partner, Ryan Wellings,
Yes.
of basically driving her to suicide.
Yeah, it was a very powerful accusation.
It really was.
And it led to a very unusual legal situation.
That's right.
Kiena's note kind of became like a voice from beyond the grave.
Yeah.
And that's what led to this kind of unusual charge of manslaughter against Ryan Wellings.
Right, and that's not something that we typically see in suicide cases.
No, not at all.
And so that's why this deep dive is so fascinating.
It really is.
Because it raises the question, can an abuser be held legally responsible for their partner's suicide?
Right.
To unpack that, we need to understand the evidence that was presented against Wellings. So what led the prosecution to pursue such a serious charge?
Well, the prosecution really built their case around the extensive evidence of the abuse that Kiena had endured. And, it wasn't just the suicide note.
Right.
Although that was incredibly powerful.
For sure.
Just imagine her note was found on her phone right next to her infant daughter.
Oh, wow.
And it detailed just horrific abuse and directly blamed Wellings.
Oh, gosh.
She said he had ruined every bit of strength she had left.
That's just awful.
It was. But it wasn't just the note. There was also testimony from her friends.
Yeah.
And messages that painted a terrifying picture.
So it wasn't just a single instance of abuse.
Right.
It was like a pattern of behavior.
Exactly. A pattern of behavior.
Oh.
And her friends recounted incidents where Wellings had threatened to douse her with acid.
Oh, my God.
Threatened to drill out her teeth.
What?
Even accounts of him attempting to strangle her.
Gosh.
And these weren't just empty threats.
Right.
They create a constant atmosphere of fear and intimidation.
And that kind of psychological torment can be just as damaging as physical violence.
Oh, absolutely.
So did the prosecution present any evidence of physical violence as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There were multiple instances of physical violence that were documented.
Gosh.
One of the most disturbing was an assault just 11 days before her death.
Oh, wow.
Wellings kicked a door into her head,
Oh, my God.
leaving her covered in blood. She even blacked out.
Oh, no.
And photos of her injuries were shown to the jury.
Oh, my.
Just undeniable evidence of the violence that she had faced.
It's just hard to fathom the level of fear and desperation that she must have felt
Oh, no.
with such strong evidence against him. How did Wellings and his defense team try to refute these allegations?
Well, the defense used several tactics,
Okay.
but their main arguments focused on two key points.
Okay.
First, they pointed to Kiena's history of mental health struggles,
Right.
including some previous suicide attempts.
Yeah.
And they tried to portray her suicide as, a tragic outcome of her own internal battles, separate from Wellings' actions.
Okay.
And this is a really common tactic, unfortunately,
Yeah.
where abusers try to shift the blame onto the victim's pre-existing vulnerabilities,
Right.
making it harder to see that direct line between their actions and the tragic outcome.
So they were basically saying that, yes, there was abuse.
Right.
It wasn't the direct cause of her death.
Yeah.
Which seems like a really difficult argument to make,
It is.
given how severe the abuse was and the timing of her suicide.
Yeah.
So what was their second point?
Their second argument really attempted to kind of downplay the severity of the abuse. Wellings claimed that any physical altercations were just attempts to restrain Kiena
Oh, okay.
during her alleged outbursts,
Okay.
not intentional acts of violence.
Gotcha.
And he tried to paint this picture of a chaotic relationship that was fueled by drug use, implying that his actions were reactive, not abusive.
It sounds like they were trying to muddy the waters a bit, create a sense of ambiguity around his actions.
Right.
So did he specifically address those chilling threats,
Yeah.
like the acid and the drill?
Wellings denied making those specific threats,
Okay.
insisting that any physical interactions were never intended to cause harm.
Yeah.
And he claimed that any injuries Kiena sustained were accidental.
Okay.
But, it raises this important question about how we view threats within the context of abuse.
Right.
Even if they're not acted upon, threats create this pervasive atmosphere of fear and control.
Yeah.
And it can be incredibly damaging to a victim's psychological well-being, even if it never results in physical harm.
It's clear that the defense was working hard to minimize Wellings' role in Keena's suffering.
Definitely.
So this brings us to a crucial point.
Yeah.
How often do we actually see manslaughter convictions in cases like this?
Manslaughter charges following a suicide are incredibly rare,
Really?
while we know domestic abuse is a significant factor in suicides.
Right.
Remember, 3 women per week in England and Wales take their own lives after experiencing abuse.
That's a lot.
Legal prosecution for manslaughter is extremely uncommon.
Why is that?
Well, it comes down to proving that direct link between the abuse and the suicide.
Is it just the challenge of proving that?
Proving causation in suicide cases is incredibly complex.
Right.
The prosecution must convince the jury that the abuser's actions were not just a factor,
Yeah.
but the direct and proximate cause of the suicide.
So, like, it was the main reason.
Yes, a very high legal bar to clear.
Okay.
In Kiena's case, they had to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt
Yeah.
that she wouldn't have taken her own life if not for Wellings' abuse.
Wow, that's a lot to prove.
It is.
Especially when dealing with something as multifaceted as suicide.
For sure.
So given this complex legal landscape and the conflicting arguments presented, what was the jury's final verdict?
So the jury found Wellings guilty of assault and coercive control.
Okay, so a partial victory.
Yeah. A significant one, though.
Right.
The verdict acknowledged the pattern of abuse that he inflicted on Kiena, recognizing that domestic abuse, goes beyond just physical violence.
Right, and this is particularly important in a case like this.
Yeah.
Where that psychological torment was so evident.
Absolutely.
It seems like a clear message that coercive control,
Right.
that web of manipulation and intimidation
Right.
is a form of abuse that the courts are starting to take very seriously.
Yeah,
But it is a mixed bag, right?
it is.
The jury acquitted him on the manslaughter charge.
Right.
What was the reaction to the verdict?
Well, the reactions were really different.
Okay.
Wellings appeared almost indifferent.
Yeah.
He was even smiling and blowing a kiss to his new girlfriend.
As he was being led away.
Yeah, as he was led away.
I mean, that lack of remorse is just chilling.
It is.
It speaks volumes about his character and
Yeah.
his inability to take responsibility for his actions.
Exactly.
Keena's family, on the other hand,
Yeah.
must have been devastated.
Oh, they were.
They were hoping for that manslaughter conviction, a legal acknowledgement of the direct role that the abuse played in her death.
Yes,
So it must have felt like justice was only partially served.
it did.
Do we know how her family reacted publicly?
We do. Kiena's mother released a really heartbreaking statement.
Okay.
She expressed her profound grief,
Yeah.
saying, I honestly cannot put into words just how much it breaks my heart that her beautiful baby girl doesn't have her mummy here because of that monster.
Oh, gosh.
And she went on to say, although a manslaughter conviction has not been achieved today, the case and the convictions of controlling and coercive behavior and assault clearly demonstrate that the perpetrators of domestic abuse will be held to account and imprisoned for what they have done.
It's a really powerful statement.
It is.
It's a mix of grief and anger,
Right.
but also a sliver of hope.
Yeah.
She acknowledged that partial victory,
Yes.
but also highlighted, the ongoing pain and the lack of full accountability.
For sure.
Her words really capture those complex emotions
They do.
that families face in these situations. They're grappling with this unimaginable loss,
Right.
but also trying to navigate a legal system that can sometimes feel inadequate
Yeah.
in addressing the full scope of the harm that was inflicted.
Absolutely.
And so it raises a lot of questions about how the legal system handles these cases
Right.
where abuse contributes to suicide.
Yes.
So is there a growing movement to hold abusers more accountable in these situations?
Absolutely. Kiena's case and others like it have reignited this crucial debate about whether abusers should be held more accountable for the mental health and suicides of their victims.
It's a really morally complex question, isn't it?
It is.
Because on the one hand, we recognize the devastating impact that abuse has on mental health.
Yes.
It's not a stretch to see how prolonged abuse could lead someone to feel so hopeless and trapped that they see suicide as the only way out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But legally, it's incredibly difficult to prove that direct causal link. To get a manslaughter conviction, you have to demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the suicide wouldn't have happened but for the abuse.
Okay.
That's a very high bar to clear.
So I imagine the defense often uses that to their advantage, right?
Yeah.
They'll bring up any other factors that might have contributed to the victim's suicide, like
Right.
mental health history,
Yeah.
other life stressors, to create that gray area of doubt,
Yeah.
even when the pattern of abuse is really clear.
Exactly. And that's where the debate gets heated.
Yeah.
Some legal experts argue that holding abusers accountable for suicide opens up a Pandora's box.
Wow.
They worry about the implications for cases where mental health is complex,
Right.
and suicide might have multiple contributing factors.
Sure.
And it raises questions about where personal responsibility begins and ends.
It's a really valid concern.
It is.
Because we wouldn't want to create a legal framework that's impossible to apply fairly or
Right.
minimizes the agency of the individual.
Right.
But on the other hand, ignoring the undeniable link between abuse and suicide feels like a failure to protect victims and hold abusers fully accountable.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
How do we create a legal system that recognizes the devastating impact of abuse on mental health
Right.
without oversimplifying the complexities of suicide?
It's a challenge that legal scholars and policymakers are really grappling with.
Absolutely.
It's clear that we need a more nuanced approach,
Yeah.
one that acknowledges that profound psychological harm that's inflicted by abuse,
Why?
while also recognizing the multifaceted nature of suicide.
Yes.
Maybe we need to consider alternative legal approaches.
Yeah.
Ones that address the specific harm of driving someone to such a state of despair.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
And it's important to note that organizations like Refuge and AFDA,
Yeah.
Organizations that are on the front lines of supporting abuse victims,
Right.
they are actively advocating for legal reforms
Right.
that reflect the realities of domestic violence.
Yeah. That's really encouraging because
Mhm.
their expertise and experience is so invaluable in shaping these conversations.
It really is.
What are these organizations specifically saying about the link between abuse and suicide?
Well, Refuge has been very clear about their stance.
Okay.
They've conducted studies showing that 1 in 4 victims have felt suicidal
Wow.
as a result of the abuse they've endured.
That's a staggering statistic.
It is.
It really underscores the gravity of this situation.
Yeah.
It's not just about, bumps and bruises.
Right.
It's about these deep psychological wounds
Yeah.
that can lead someone to feel like there's just no hope left.
Exactly. And Refuge has stated that improved recognition of how domestic abuse can directly cause trauma and suicide is paramount in ensuring as many victim survivors as possible are able to get justice.
Wow.
That they're actively campaigning for a world where we see no more lives lost to this devastating crime.
Their work is so crucial in raising awareness and advocating for change.
Right.
What about AFDA?
So AFDA,
What's their perspective?
which focuses on supporting families after fatal domestic abuse,
Right.
really emphasizes the importance of thorough investigations in these cases.
Okay.
They argue that all too often, investigations into abuse-related suicides are inadequate, superficial, or non-existent.
It's like we're failing to connect the dots
Exactly.
to see that full picture of how abuse contributes to these tragic outcomes.
You got it. That's exactly their point.
Wow.
And in Keena's case, they acknowledged that the police investigation was thorough.
Okay.
But they stress that this isn't always the norm.
Right.
They're advocating for standardized protocols and specialized training for law enforcement
Okay.
to ensure that abuse-related suicides are properly investigated
Yeah.
and the victims' voices are heard.
It makes sense because without thorough investigations,
Yeah.
we can't hope to understand the full scope of the problem
Right.
or hold abusers accountable.
Exactly. Now, to fully understand the challenges of prosecuting these cases,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that manslaughter convictions following a suicide are incredibly rare.
Right. You mentioned earlier that an estimated 3 women take their own lives each week in England and Wales after experiencing domestic abuse.
Yes.
So why, then, are there so few manslaughter charges? Well, is it simply the difficulty of proving that direct causal link?
That's a major part of it.
Okay.
To secure a manslaughter conviction,
Mm-hmm.
the prosecution has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the victim's suicide would not have occurred but for the abuser's actions.
Gotcha.
This means demonstrating that the abuse was the direct and proximate cause of death,
Okay.
overriding any other contributing factors.
So even if the abuse created an environment of, fear, despair, hopelessness,
Yeah,
it's incredibly difficult to prove it was the sole and determining factor
it is.
in the victim's decision to take their own life.
Exactly. The defense can often successfully introduce reasonable doubt
Yeah.
by highlighting other potential contributing factors,
Okay.
such as pre-existing mental health conditions, personal stressors, or even just the inherent complexities of suicide itself.
It sounds like proving causation in these cases is a bit like trying to untangle a knotted mess of thread,
Oh, that's a great analogy.
with the defense, pulling on any loose strand to create enough doubt to sway a jury.
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
Because of this complexity,
Yeah.
many prosecutors hesitate to even bring manslaughter charges in cases where the victim died by suicide,
Yay.
even when there's clear evidence of abuse. They know the burden of proof is incredibly high,
Right.
and the likelihood of a conviction is slim.
It's a frustrating reality, especially for the families who are left seeking justice and accountability.
Yeah.
You know, what we need is a legal framework that recognizes the link between abuse and suicide
Right.
without setting an impossible standard of proof.
You're right. It's about finding that middle ground.
Yeah.
How do we acknowledge the psychological harm inflicted by abuse and hold abusers accountable for pushing victims to such a state of despair without minimizing the agency of the individual?
Yeah.
Or oversimplifying the issue of suicide.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It really is.
Perhaps legal reforms could explore alternative charges
Yes.
that specifically address the harm of driving someone to suicide
Right.
without requiring that absolute proof of causation.
Yeah.
Something that captures that psychological torture, that erosion of hope that makes suicide feel like the only option.
That's an interesting idea and something legal experts are considering.
Okay.
It's about recognizing that abuse can be a slow, insidious killer,
Yeah.
chipping away at a victim's resilience until they see no other way out.
Keena's case brings this issue to light in such a powerful way.
It does.
And even though the manslaughter charge wasn't successful,
Yeah,
it sparked a conversation that we need to continue having.
absolutely. Keena's story and the stories of countless other victims underscore the urgent need for systemic change.
Yes.
We need to support victims, recognize the signs of abuse, and hold abusers accountable for the full spectrum of harm they inflict.
Right.
It's not just about physical violence.
Right.
It's about the psychological manipulation,
Yeah.
the control, the erosion of a person's spirit
Yeah.
that can ultimately lead to such tragic outcomes.
Well said. Now let's delve into the specifics of Wellings' sentencing
Okay.
for the assault and coercive control convictions.
Right.
What kind of punishment did he actually receive?
Well, unfortunately, the specific details of his sentence weren't provided in the source material.
Oh, okay.
It's not uncommon for those details to be withheld from public reporting in cases involving domestic violence
I see.
to protect the privacy of the victim and their family.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah,
Although it does leave us with some unanswered questions.
he does.
But based on what we know about his convictions,
Right.
can we at least speculate about the potential range of punishment?
We can definitely look at the typical sentencing guidelines for assault and coercive control.
Okay, so for the assault charge, the sentence could range from a fine
Right.
to a prison term, depending on the severity of the assault,
Yeah.
the extent of Keena's injuries, and any aggravating factors, like
Yeah.
using a weapon or having a history of violence.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The judge would take all of that into account when determining the appropriate sentence.
Okay, and then there's the coercive control conviction.
Yes.
Now, that's a relatively new offense in England and Wales, right?
It is.
It's designed to address those non-physical aspects of abuse that can be so damaging.
Yeah, you're right. Coercive control recognizes that insidious pattern of behavior abusers use to dominate their victims.
Oh.
Things like isolation, financial control,
Yeah.
emotional manipulation,
Right.
threats of violence.
Yeah.
It's all about power and control, making the victim feel trapped and powerless.
And because it's a relatively new offense,
Right.
I imagine there's still a lot of variation in how it's being prosecuted and sentenced.
You're absolutely right. There's no set formula.
Yeah.
So it's hard to predict exactly what Wellings' sentence would have entailed,
Right.
but it likely involved a combination of prison time,
Okay.
potential restraining orders,
Gotcha.
and
Right.
possibly mandatory counseling or rehabilitation programs.
It's encouraging that the legal system is starting to recognize and address coercive control
Yeah,
as a distinct form of abuse.
it is.
It sends a message that these non-physical tactics are just as damaging
Right.
and unacceptable as physical violence.
For sure.
Yeah.
Now, this case really raises a fascinating question
Yeah.
that often comes up in cases involving abuse-related suicides.
Okay, what is it?
Why, despite the overwhelming evidence of abuse,
Right.
was Wellings acquitted of manslaughter?
Yeah. It's a question that goes to the heart of the challenges that we've been discussing.
It does.
The jury clearly believed that Kiena was subjected to this horrific abuse, yet they didn't find him directly responsible for her death.
Yeah,
It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
it does.
You know, if the evidence of the violence, the threats, the psychological torment
Yeah.
was so strong. Why wasn't that enough to convict him of manslaughter?
Well, this acquittal perfectly illustrates how difficult it is to prove causation beyond a reasonable doubt
Okay.
in cases involving suicide.
Yeah.
To get that manslaughter conviction,
Right.
the prosecution had to demonstrate that Keena's suicide wouldn't have happened but for Wellings' abuse.
Right. It's that incredibly high legal bar that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
So even if we intuitively understand the link between abuse and suicide,
Right.
the legal system demands this more concrete connection.
It does.
So they had to prove that his actions were the sole and determining factor,
Yes.
essentially overriding any other potential contributing factors.
Precisely. And the defense, as is often the case, used that to their advantage.
How so?
They brought up Keena's history of mental health struggles, her previous suicide attempts,
Right.
to create that seed of doubt,
Yeah.
to suggest that maybe, just maybe,
Yeah.
the suicide would have happened anyway,
Right.
regardless of Wellings' actions.
It's a tactic that seems designed to shift the focus,
Yes.
to muddy the waters just enough
Yeah.
to make the jury question that direct link
Yeah,
between the abuse and the tragic outcome.
exactly. And this is where the conversation about legal reform becomes so crucial.
Okay.
How do we create a system that acknowledges that undeniable link between abuse and suicide
Yeah,
without requiring that absolute proof of causation?
that's the question.
It is.
And Keena's case is a stark example of why this conversation is so important.
Absolutely.
It feels like we're failing victims
Yeah.
when we can't adequately address the ways in which abuse contributes to their deaths.
I agree. And it's not just about seeking justice in individual cases.
Okay.
It's about sending a message
Mm-hmm.
that this kind of psychological harm,
Yeah.
the kind that can drive someone to take their own life, is unacceptable and will be held accountable.
Absolutely.
We need to change the narrative.
Yeah.
To challenge those societal norms that allow abusers to minimize their actions and blame the victims for their own suffering.
To dig deeper into the specifics of this case,
Yeah.
let's rewind a bit
Okay.
and look closely at the details of the abuse that Kiena endured.
Okay.
You know, those details are crucial because they really paint a picture
You do.
of the systematic and relentless nature of Wellings' abuse
Yes.
and how he gradually eroded Kiena's sense of self
Yeah.
and trapped her in the cycle of fear and dependence.
I think that's a great place to pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We'll delve into the evidence presented at the trial,
Okay.
the specific instances of abuse,
Mm-hmm.
and what they reveal about the dynamics of this tragic case. We're back, and I gotta say, diving into the details of this case is really unsettling.
Yeah.
But as we said, understanding the specifics of the abuse that Kiena faced is crucial to grasp the full impact of this tragedy.
Yeah.
So where should we begin? Well, we know from the testimony and the evidence that the abuse was kind of a slow burn at first.
Okay.
You know, and initially, her friends described their relationship as like a whirlwind romance, almost like a fairy tale.
Right.
And, you know, it's important to remember that many abusers are incredibly charming.
Yeah.
At first, you know,
Okay.
they create this false sense of security.
It's that classic love bombing tactic that we see in so many abusive relationships.
Exactly.
You know, showering the victim with attention and affection,
Yeah,
making them feel special, only to later reveal their true colors.
Right. And in Keena's case, Wellings fit that pattern.
Yeah.
He became infatuated very quickly. He even got a tattoo of her name very early on,
Wow.
which seemed romantic at the time.
Yeah.
But knowing the abuse that followed, it takes on a much more sinister meaning.
Almost like a marking of ownership
Yeah.
rather than a genuine expression of love.
Right.
When did the warning signs start appearing?
Well, as the relationship progressed, friends noticed these subtle changes in Kiena.
Okay.
He became more withdrawn, less confident, more anxious.
Right. And those are often the first subtle signs.
They are.
But they can be so easily dismissed.
Yeah,
Especially by the victim who might be in denial or afraid to acknowledge what's happening.
exactly. And unfortunately, in Keena's case, these subtle shifts were followed by more overt forms of abuse.
Okay, so was there a specific turning point,
Yeah.
a moment when the abuse escalated?
I'd say one of the first major incidents happened during lockdown in 2020,
Okay.
just a few months into their relationship.
Wow.
Wellings flew into a rage,
Okay.
fueled by jealousy.
Mm-hmm.
He smashed up their flat,
Oh my gosh.
and he tried to strangle Kiena
What?
with a phone charger cable.
It's chilling how quickly the violence escalated, you know, using an everyday object as a weapon.
Yeah.
And it underscores that point that, you know, for many victims,
Yes.
The danger is greatest in their own homes.
Right.
A place where they should feel safest.
Absolutely. That's a great point.
And this incident really marked a shift in their relationship.
It did.
It went from primarily emotional abuse
Yeah.
to physical violence.
Right.
And that pattern unfortunately continued.
It did.
So I'm guessing this was followed by apologies, promises to change.
Of course.
That classic cycle of abuse.
You got it. Wellings apologized, profusely showered Kiena with gifts,
Oh, wow.
swore he would never do it again.
Yeah,
He blamed stress alcohol,
of course.
anything but himself.
Right.
And that's the insidious part of this cycle.
Yeah.
The abuser manipulates the victim into believing that they're truly remorseful,
Right.
that things will be different.
That this time it'll be different.
Exactly.
And it's that manipulation, that constant back and forth
Yeah.
that makes it so difficult for victims to break free because
Right.
they get caught in this web of hope and fear,
Mm-hmm.
believing that maybe this time the abuser will really change.
Yeah, and sadly, in most cases, the abuse continues, often escalating.
Right.
In Keena's case, the violence continued.
Yeah.
Wellings exerted increasing control over her life,
Okay.
isolating her from friends and family, dictating who she could see and where she could go.
Right. That isolation is a classic tactic of abusers.
It is.
You know, they cut the victim off from their support system, making them more reliant on the abuser, both emotionally and practically.
Exactly. And along with the social isolation, he controlled her finances,
Oh, wow.
limiting her access to money,
Yeah.
making her financially dependent on him.
Right. So it was all about power and control.
It was.
Stripping away her independence,
Yeah.
making her feel completely trapped.
Right. And on top of all that, he subjected her to constant verbal and emotional abuse.
Oh, gosh.
You know, belittling her,
Yeah.
criticizing her appearance, undermining her self-worth.
That drip, drip, drip of negativity that can wear a person down.
Yeah, can.
Make them question their own reality.
Yes.
And often it goes hand in hand with those threats of violence.
It does.
Keeping the victim in a state of perpetual fear.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in Keena's case, the threats were particularly chilling.
Right.
Remember those messages where Wellings threatened to throw acid in her face?
Oh, yeah.
Drill out her teeth?
Yeah, it's awful.
Those threats were designed to instill terror,
Yeah.
to make her constantly fear for her safety.
And those threats, even if never acted upon,
Right.
have such a profound psychological impact.
They do.
It's a form of torture, really.
It is.
They create an environment where the victim is always on edge,
Yeah.
never knowing when that next outburst might occur.
It becomes a way for the abuser to maintain control, even when they're not physically present.
Wow.
The victim's living in this constant state of fear and anticipation.
Despite this escalating nightmare, it seems Kiena did find moments of strength.
She did.
You know, she confided in friends.
Yeah.
She shared details of the abuse.
Uh-huh.
She even documented it herself.
Yeah.
Leaving those hidden notes on her phone.
That takes incredible courage
It does.
to break the silence
Yeah.
and seek help.
Yeah.
Try to create a record of what was happening.
It speaks volumes about her determination to be heard,
It does.
even in the face of such overwhelming fear.
Absolutely.
But sadly, her attempts to escape the abuse were met with further manipulation.
Right.
Think back to that incident where Wellings gave her a black eye while she was pregnant.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to imagine something so cruel and cowardly.
It is. What did he say to her when she threatened to report the abuse?
I know.
He used her vulnerability against her.
Of course he did.
He told her that no one would believe her because of her mental health history.
Oh, gosh.
He even threatened to have their child taken away.
Oh, my
A
God.
threat designed to exploit her deepest fear.
It's just monstrous.
It is.
Using her love for her child as leverage to keep her silent.
Exactly.
It just reinforces how abusers prey on their victims' vulnerabilities, their deepest fears.
Yeah.
And it explains why so many victims hesitate to come forward.
Right.
They're terrified of the repercussions of not being believed, of losing their children.
It's true. This case really highlights those systemic barriers
Yes.
that prevent victims from seeking help.
We need to do more to create safe spaces for victims to come forward,
Yeah.
to ensure that they know they will be believed
Right.
and supported.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now we can't wrap up this deep dive without revisiting that final assault.
Yeah.
The brutal attack just 11 days before Kiena's death.
Right. We know Wellings kicked a door into her head,
It did.
leaving her covered in blood.
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to fathom the physical and emotional pain that she must have been in.
I know. And, this attack was the combination of everything we've been talking about.
Yeah.
The violence,
Yeah.
the control, the utter disregard for her well-being.
It's impossible to know for certain what was going through her mind in those final days.
Right.
But you can only imagine the despair that she must have felt.
It's heartbreaking to think that she was so close to escaping that nightmare,
Yeah.
to building a new life for herself and her daughter,
Mm-hmm.
only to have her hope extinguished by this brutal act of violence.
This case really brings to light the complexities of abuse-related suicides
It does.
and the challenges that the legal system faces in holding abusers accountable,
Absolutely.
even when the evidence of abuse is overwhelming.
Right.
Proving that direct causal link to the suicide is incredibly difficult.
It is. It's a reminder that we need to continue this conversation.
Yeah.
To push for legal reforms that better address the psychological harm inflicted by abusers,
Yeah.
and to create a society where victims feel empowered to come forward and seek help.
It's a heavy topic,
It is.
but it's a conversation that we can't shy away from.
We can't. So as we end this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm left with a question for our listeners.
Okay.
What will you do to contribute to that change?
Yeah.
How will you use this knowledge to make a difference in the fight against domestic violence?
It's a great question.
Keena's story is a tragic reminder
Yeah.
that we all have a role to play
We do.
in creating a safer,
Yeah.
more just world.
Absolutely.